Some people think a deadline gives them power. Sometimes it just tells you exactly how much time they have left before the truth catches up. Rain hammered the old concrete spillway hard enough to blur the tree line across Black Pine Lake, but I could still make out the white luxury SUV climbing the narrow service road toward the dam. The windshield wipers beat a steady rhythm against my truck while the warning bell inside the control house chimed every few seconds, the same metallic sound my Uncle Arthur used to call the heartbeat of the lake. I checked my watch. 4:59. 1 hour left. 71 hours had already passed since the woman from Silver Crest Shores HOA slid a packet of legal papers across my kitchen table and informed me that I had exactly 72 hours to sign away a 3,200-acre private lake I had inherited less than a week earlier. The smell of wet pine drifted through my open window, mixing with damp concrete and the faint scent of machine oil that had soaked into the dam decades before I was born. I stepped out into the rain, my boots crunching against loose gravel as the SUV rolled to a stop only a few yards away. The driver's door opened first. Denise Holbrook climbed out wearing a cream-colored raincoat that somehow still looked expensive despite the weather. She never hurried. She moved like someone who had spent years believing every piece of ground beneath her heels already belonged to her. Behind her came a sharply dressed attorney balancing a leather portfolio beneath his jacket and two private security officers standing just far enough back to make their presence obvious without saying a word. Denise smiled the moment she saw me. It wasn't friendly. It was the kind of smile real estate agents wear right before telling someone they're getting a fantastic deal while quietly taking the best part of it for themselves. She carried a navy blue folder under one arm and walked straight toward the hood of my truck. Without asking permission, she laid the folder across the wet metal, opened it carefully, and pressed one manicured finger against a signature line that already had my name printed beneath it. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice almost gentle beneath the rain. "Your deadline expires at 5 o'clock. Sign this voluntary transfer agreement, and Silver Crest Shores will assume responsibility for maintaining the lake. Refuse, and we'll pursue every legal remedy available." I looked down at the papers without touching them. Voluntary transfer of water asset. Those words almost made me laugh. Voluntary. Funny choice when someone spends 3 straight days threatening lawsuits, liens, and court orders. A gust of wind rippled across the lake behind us, carrying tiny waves against the stone shoreline. Somewhere farther down the embankment, heavy equipment rumbled to life. I turned just enough to see an excavator lowering its bucket toward one of the old brass survey markers buried near the access road. The bucket struck the ground with a dull metallic thud. Denise never even looked back. She kept watching my face instead. That told me everything I needed to know. She knew exactly what that marker represented. She knew her crew wasn't removing scrap metal. They were destroying evidence. I slipped one hand into my jacket pocket and felt the cold outline of an old brass key resting there, smooth from decades of use. Uncle Arthur had handed it to me years ago with a grin and a sentence I hadn't fully understood until now. "The lake remembers who respects it," he had said. "Paperwork just helps everyone else catch up." Denise mistook my silence for hesitation. "I know this has been emotional," she continued, lowering her voice as if she were offering sympathy instead of an ultimatum. "Managing a property this large isn't realistic for one individual. Our homeowners have relied on this lake for years. Sign today, and this can all end peacefully." I finally looked her in the eyes. "You really think this ends today?" I asked. She folded her arms confidently. "It ends at 5. I glanced past her toward the excavator as another survey marker disappeared beneath fresh dirt. Then I checked my watch one more time. 4:59. She believed she had given me 72 hours to surrender my inheritance. She never realized she had given me exactly 72 hours to discover what she had already stolen. I did not even know Uncle Arthur had changed his will until a county probate attorney called me on a gray Monday morning while I was inspecting a wetland restoration project 2 counties away. The smell of fresh mud and river reeds still clung to my boots when he asked if I could drive to his office before the courthouse closed. I assumed there had been some mistake. Arthur had always joked that the only things worth inheriting were old fishing stories and rusted tools. He lived alone in a weathered log cabin tucked into the northern shoreline, surrounded by towering white pines that muffled the outside world. Growing up, I spent every summer there. He taught me how to read cloud reflections on calm water, how to judge incoming rain by the smell of the wind, and how every shoreline tells a different story if you stand still long enough. When I walked into the attorney's office, the room smelled like old paper, coffee, and polished oak furniture that had probably been there longer than either of us. The attorney slid a thick envelope across his desk without saying much. Inside were property records, tax documents, and one folded map drawn on faded canvas that looked older than I was. My name appeared where I never expected to see it. Sole beneficiary. Black Pine Lake. 3,200 acres. Every inch of shoreline. Every acre beneath the water. Every access road, maintenance easement, spillway, dock permit, timber section, and conservation agreement. I stared at the pages so long that the attorney quietly pushed a glass of water toward me. He finally broke the silence by saying, "Your uncle believed you would understand what this place actually was." I remember asking him why Arthur had never mentioned any of it. The attorney smiled faintly before reaching beneath the desk and placing 3 more items beside the documents. The first was a heavy brass key with years of scratches worn into its edges. The second was a leather-bound notebook swollen from decades of humidity. The third was a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Underneath my name were 7 words. Open only when they give you a deadline. I turned the envelope over twice, but did not open it. At the time, the sentence made no sense. I slipped it into my jacket beside the brass key, thinking it was simply another one of Arthur's puzzles. The drive to Black Pine Lake took almost 4 hours. The farther north I traveled, the fewer houses I saw. Asphalt turned into gravel, gravel became packed dirt, and eventually the familiar smell of pine sap drifted through the cracked truck window. By sunset, I reached the old entrance gate. The hinges groaned exactly the way they had 20 years earlier. The cabin still leaned slightly toward the water. The weathered porch still overlooked the lake. Even the old aluminum canoe remained upside down beside the woodshed where Arthur always left it before winter. Everything felt frozen in time except for one thing. Across the eastern shoreline, where there had once been uninterrupted forest, rows of expensive lakeside homes stretched along the water. Fresh roofs reflected the evening sun. Private docks reached into the lake like fingers. White fencing traced manicured lawns all the way to the shoreline. At first, I assumed the development simply bordered the property. Then I noticed something that made me stop walking. Large blue signs stood beside several docks with polished silver lettering. Silver Crest Shores Private Community Lake. I read the words twice. Then I looked down at the canvas survey map resting in my hands. The shoreline beneath those signs was clearly inside the property Arthur had just left to me. I stood there until the last light disappeared behind the western ridge, listening to water lap softly against the old cedar dock, while the neighborhood across the lake glowed with perfectly timed landscape lighting. It looked beautiful from a distance, almost like a postcard. Up close, something felt wrong. Every dock carried the same polished aluminum sign with the Silver Crest Shores logo. Decorative flags lined the shoreline. Small rental kayaks were stacked beside a floating marina that definitely had not existed when I was a kid. The smell of charcoal drifted across the water from someone's outdoor kitchen, while faint laughter echoed over the lake. Whoever built that community had convinced hundreds of people they belonged there. The next morning, I followed the eastern shoreline on foot, using Arthur's old canvas map to compare every bend in the water with what I saw in front of me. The map matched perfectly. Every rocky point, every narrow cove, every marsh inlet sat exactly where Arthur had drawn them decades earlier. The only difference was everything people had built on top of them. New boardwalks extended farther into the lake than I expected. Decorative stone walls had replaced natural shoreline in several places. The largest surprise waited near the southern peninsula. A massive clubhouse overlooked the water with oversized windows reflecting the morning sun. Beside it stood a polished wooden sign reading Silver Crest Shores Lake Pavilion members only. I stopped walking when I realized the pavilion itself appeared to sit directly inside the property boundary shown on Arthur's survey. Before I could study it longer, a white golf cart rolled toward me across the paved path. The woman driving stepped out before the cart fully stopped. She looked exactly like someone who had spent years introducing herself at charity galas and homeowner meetings. Perfect hair despite the humidity. Crisp cream blouse. Designer sunglasses resting on her head. Even her smile looked professionally rehearsed. "You must be Nolan Whitaker," she said before I introduced myself. "I am Denise Holbrook, president of the Homeowners Association." She extended her hand with effortless confidence. I shook it once. Her grip was firm, but her eyes immediately drifted toward the rolled survey map tucked beneath my arm. "I was very sorry to hear about Arthur," she continued. "He was protective." There was a slight pause before the last word, almost as though she had chosen a more polite replacement. "I appreciate that," I answered. "I'm just trying to understand what belongs where." Denise laughed softly, the kind of practiced laugh that encouraged agreement before disagreement even had a chance. "Property lines confuse everyone. Fortunately, we have handled lake operations for years. Residents depend on us. Boat safety, shoreline maintenance, community events, environmental stewardship." Arthur eventually realized one man could not manage all this forever. She gestured across the water where dozens of private docks stretched into the lake. "We have invested millions maintaining this community." I looked back toward the shoreline. "Interesting," I said, "because none of those improvements appear anywhere in my closing documents." Her smile narrowed only slightly before recovering. "Paperwork always lags behind reality." That sentence stayed with me. Paperwork always lags behind reality. Coming from a woman who sold luxury real estate, it sounded less like conversation and more like a strategy. She invited me inside the clubhouse for coffee. The building smelled of fresh cedar, expensive leather furniture, and citrus furniture polish. Framed aerial photographs covered one wall, showing neighborhood expansion over nearly a decade. One photograph caught my attention immediately. It showed the original shoreline before construction began. The image clearly included Arthur's old maintenance road leading to the dam. In the newest photograph hanging beside it, that same road had disappeared beneath landscaped walking paths and decorative stone entrances carrying the Silver Crest Shore's name. Denise noticed where I was looking. "Progress," she said proudly. "People like belonging to something larger than themselves." I nodded without answering. Then I noticed a large framed map displayed behind the reception desk. Every inch of Black Pine Lake had been colored the same shade of blue. Across the center, bold gold letters declared community-owned recreational waters. I did not say a word. I simply stared at the map while a familiar feeling settled in my stomach. Someone had spent years making ownership look official long before anyone bothered asking who actually owned the lake. When I returned to the cabin that afternoon, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The usual wind moving through the pines was still there. The water still rolled gently against the old dock. But another sound had disappeared. The low mechanical hum coming from the spillway control house was gone. Uncle Arthur always said that if the control system ever went quiet without a reason, someone had touched something they should not have touched. I walked the narrow gravel path toward the concrete building, and before I reached the steel door, I saw fresh tire tracks pressed into the damp ground. They had not been there that morning. The smell of wet soil mixed with fresh diesel lingered in the air. Someone had driven heavy equipment onto the property while I was meeting Denise. The brass padlock Arthur had installed years earlier no longer hung from the door. A brand new commercial lock had replaced it. Bright silver, not even scratched. A laminated notice had been zip-tied to the handle. Authorized access only. Silver Crest Shores Operations. I read it twice before looking around the clearing. The old maintenance truck Arthur kept beside the shed was still parked where he left it, but several orange traffic cones now blocked the service road leading toward the spillway gate. None of it made sense. Less than 24 hours earlier, I had inherited the property. Somehow an organization that did not appear anywhere in my legal documents was already behaving like permanent management. I photographed everything before touching a single thing. Every cone, every lock, every tire mark, every sign. Years working with environmental permits had taught me one lesson that mattered more than arguing. Cameras remember details emotions never do. Before I finished taking pictures, a pickup truck with Silver Crest Shores maintenance decals rolled slowly down the road. Two workers stepped out wearing matching green polo shirts. They looked surprised to see me standing there. One cleared his throat before speaking. "Can we help you, sir?" I pointed toward the new lock. "Who authorized that?" The older worker shifted uncomfortably. "We were instructed to secure the facility yesterday." "By who?" He hesitated just long enough to answer my question without actually answering it. "Management." I asked whether they had a work order. Neither man produced one. Instead, they climbed back into the truck after politely explaining they were only following instructions. As they drove away, I noticed both avoided making eye contact through the side mirrors. That evening, another surprise arrived. A certified envelope rested inside the mailbox at the entrance gate. The paper smelled fresh from the printer. The letterhead belonged to Silvercrest Shores Homeowners Association. According to the notice, I had violated community operating standards by entering restricted recreational areas without prior authorization. It demanded immediate compliance and instructed me to contact the association before accessing shoreline facilities again. At the bottom sat another document titled Voluntary Stewardship Transition Agreement. The language sounded friendly until I reached the final page. If I declined to transfer operational ownership of the lake within 72 hours, the association would initiate legal proceedings to preserve community reliance interests and seek emergency management authority through the county court. I read that sentence 3 times while sitting on Arthur's porch listening to frogs begin their evening chorus across the water. The timing felt strangely organized. They had replaced locks before speaking to me. They had already printed notices with my name. They already had legal paperwork waiting. This had not been created overnight. Someone had expected Arthur to be gone long before I arrived. My phone buzzed just after sunset. It was my younger sister, Audrey. Her voice sounded tired after another day balancing forensic accounting clients. I explained everything from the new locks to the demand letter. She stayed quiet for several seconds before asking one simple question. Nolan, did they know Uncle Arthur was dying before anyone else did? I looked across the dark lake where dozens of lights reflected off the water like floating stars. For the first time since opening Arthur's will, I realized this was never about introducing themselves to the new owner. They had been preparing for my arrival long before I knew I was coming. I barely slept that night. Every few hours I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the cabin roof or the distant cry of loons somewhere across the lake. Before sunrise, I poured a mug of black coffee into Arthur's old enamel cup and spread every document from the attorney across the kitchen table. The faded canvas survey rested beside the official probate records while the brass key sat exactly where I had left it. The smell of coffee mixed with old pine boards and yellowed paper filled the room. I compared every parcel number line by line, looking for anything that might explain how an entire neighborhood had convinced itself the lake belonged to them. Around 8 o'clock, I drove into the county seat and walked straight into the recorder's office. The building had the familiar scent of aging files and floor polish that every courthouse seems to share. A clerk helped me locate the digital property maps connected to Black Pine Lake. At first glance, everything appeared normal. My inheritance covered the surrounding forest exactly as expected. Then I zoomed in on the lake itself. My stomach tightened. Instead of listing private ownership beneath the water boundaries, the county map labeled the surface as Community Recreational Basin. That wording had never appeared in Arthur's documents. I asked the clerk when the description had changed. She clicked through several records before frowning slightly. Looks like an administrative revision about 6 months ago, she said. No ownership transfer recorded. Just a mapping update. Administrative revision. Those 2 words echoed in my head during the entire drive back. Maps do not simply change because someone decides they should. Somebody had requested that revision. Somebody wanted the public record to look different without changing the actual deed. I stopped by the office of a local property attorney hoping for a quick explanation. After reviewing the county map, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. Ownership and public records do not always move together, he said carefully. If an organization openly manages land for years without objection, they sometimes build arguments around operational control. It does not automatically change ownership, but it can complicate things. He looked directly at me. Do not sign anything until every historical survey has been verified. That advice should have reassured me. Instead, it confirmed my concern. Denise was not relying on one piece of paper. She was building a story. Every sign, every dock, every maintenance crew, every event at the pavilion, every map hanging inside the clubhouse pushed the same message. Repeat something long enough, and people stop asking who wrote it first. By the time I returned to the cabin, Audrey was waiting beside my truck. She had driven almost 3 hours after finishing work because she wanted to see everything herself. We spent the afternoon reviewing tax records, maintenance invoices, and Arthur's notebooks spread across the dining table. Audrey's background in forensic accounting made her notice details I would have ignored. Several years of county tax payments included separate assessments for shoreline conservation, yet Silvercrest Shore's newsletters advertised a lake preservation fee collected from every homeowner. "Where is that money going?" she asked quietly while highlighting figures with a yellow marker. Neither of us knew. Before I could answer, another vehicle stopped outside the cabin. A courier handed me a second certified envelope requiring my signature. Denise had shortened the deadline. Instead of 72 hours, the letter declared the association expected my decision within 36. Construction would begin immediately on expanded community parking near the eastern shoreline unless I objected through formal legal action. The pages were still warm from the printer. I looked out the cabin window toward the lake where the afternoon sun shimmered across the water exactly the way it had when I was a child. Everything looked peaceful. Yet every hour the paperwork grew more aggressive while the shoreline quietly changed around me. For the first time, I understood that if I spent all my time reacting to Denise's deadlines, I would never discover who had rewritten the map before I even arrived. The answer had been sitting inside Arthur's cabin the entire time. I just had not known where to look. Audrey had fallen asleep in the old rocking chair with financial statements spread across her lap, while I wandered into the storage room behind the stone fireplace, searching for anything connected to the original surveys. Dust floated through narrow beams of afternoon sunlight, and every shelf smelled of cedar, engine oil, and aging paper. Most of the boxes held ordinary things. Old fishing reels, lanterns, spare dock hardware. Then I noticed a weathered metal tube tucked behind a stack of hand tools. Arthur always stored important maps inside sealed survey tubes to keep moisture away. I twisted the cap loose, and a faded canvas rolled gently onto the workbench. The edges were worn smooth from decades of handling, but the ink remained surprisingly clear. Across the bottom sat the signature of Walter Price, licensed county surveyor, dated 1989. I recognized the name immediately. Arthur had mentioned Walter dozens of times while teaching me how to read boundary markers. According to Arthur, Walter never guessed where a property line belonged. He proved it. I called the number listed in an old address book and, to my surprise, Walter answered on the second ring. His voice sounded slower than I remembered, but he agreed to meet me at sunrise near the northern marsh. The next morning fog floated low across the water, wrapping the shoreline in a pale gray blanket. The smell of wet grass and fresh water filled the cold air as Walter stepped carefully out of his pickup carrying a faded leather field bag. His hair had turned completely white, but his eyes still scanned the landscape like a man measuring invisible lines no one else could see. He unrolled Arthur's canvas map across the hood of my truck without saying a word. After several minutes, he pointed toward a stand of cattails beside the access road. "There should be a brass monument about 3 feet below the surface," he said quietly. We borrowed a post-hole digger from the maintenance shed and began digging through packed soil. Barely 20 minutes later, the metal blade struck something solid with a sharp ringing sound. Walter smiled for the first time that morning. We brushed away damp earth until the rounded top of a brass survey monument appeared exactly where his map predicted. Its identification number matched the survey perfectly. We repeated the process at 2 more locations. Every monument remained exactly where Walter had placed it nearly 4 decades earlier. The county map had changed. The ground had not. Walter traced one finger along the shoreline on the canvas survey before looking directly at me. "Arthur never owned just the land around this lake," he said. "He owned the lakebed itself. That is a very different thing." My heartbeat quickened. He explained that ownership of the lakebed meant control over nearly every permanent structure extending into the water unless separate legal easements existed. We drove toward the eastern marina and compared the old survey with modern construction. Dock after dock stretched well beyond the narrow access corridor shown on the original plat. The large pavilion stood entirely outside the only recreational easement Walter had recorded. Even more surprising, the main pump station supplying irrigation water to the neighborhood sat directly on property inherited from Arthur. Audrey arrived carrying copies of financial statements she had reviewed overnight. She spread them across the tailgate beside the survey. "Look at this," she said. "Silvercrest Shores has collected lake preservation fees from homeowners for 8 straight years." She pointed to another column highlighted in yellow. The money was transferred to a management company called Blue Horizon Community Services. I searched the business registration on my phone. Denise Holbrook appeared as the registered managing member. Walter slowly removed his glasses and looked across the lake toward the clubhouse. "Your uncle always worried someone would mistake access for ownership," he said softly. I reached into my jacket and felt the unopened envelope Arthur had left for me. For the first time since inheriting Black Pine Lake, I realized I had finally uncovered the first piece of the truth. Denise had not built her authority on ownership. She had built it on the assumption that no one would ever bother checking where the real boundary actually began. I still had not opened Arthur's envelope. It rested inside my jacket pocket every time I walked the shoreline, its edges growing softer from being carried, but never unfolded. Something told me to wait a little longer. Arthur had never been careless with words, and if he had written that I should open it only after someone gave me a deadline, then there had to be a reason. By my watch, less than 19 hours remained before Denise expected my signature. Instead of calling another attorney or arguing with the homeowners association, I drove back to the cabin, spread every survey across the dining table, and started asking a different question. If Denise truly believed the lake already belonged to the community, why was she working so hard to convince me to sign it away? The answer seemed obvious once I said it out loud. She did not need my signature if she already owned it. She needed my signature because she did not. Audrey looked up from her laptop as I paced across the room. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with old paper while rain tapped softly against the cabin windows. "Then stop reacting to her," she said. "Make her explain herself." Those 6 words changed everything. Instead of answering another threatening letter, I drafted one of my own. It was polite, professional, and intentionally simple. I thanked Denise for her willingness to assume future operational responsibility if an agreement could be reached. Before considering any transfer, however, I requested a complete inventory of every structure, utility, revenue source, access corridor, maintenance facility, marina, shoreline improvement, and water management asset currently operated by Silver Crest Shores in connection with Black Pine Lake. I also requested documentation identifying the legal authority under which each facility was being managed. There was nothing confrontational about the request. It simply asked her to describe what she believed she controlled. I sent the letter by electronic mail and certified delivery before noon. Her response arrived less than 2 hours later. Confidence makes people careless. Denise attached a beautifully organized spreadsheet complete with logos, color coding, and management summaries. According to her own records, the Homeowners Association controlled 146 private boat slips, 2 public launch ramps, a lakeside event pavilion, 3 shoreline parking areas, the irrigation pump station, the spillway observation platform, several maintenance buildings, and the primary access road leading to the eastern marina. I read the list twice before handing the pages to Walter. He slowly smiled without saying a word. Every major improvement Denise proudly listed stood either completely or partially inside Arthur's surveyed property. Even more important, she had personally admitted it in writing. Audrey was already tracing another thread. She compared Denise's inventory against 8 years of financial records and quietly circled line after line with a red pen. Boat slip rentals, pavilion reservations, community festivals, wedding venue deposits, preservation assessments, irrigation maintenance fees. Every dollar depended on facilities Denise had just acknowledged managing. "She documented her entire business model for you," Audrey whispered. Voluntarily. That afternoon, I finally unfolded Arthur's envelope. Inside rested a single handwritten note and 1 yellowed photocopy. The note contained only 1 sentence. "The lake is not the asset. The access is." Behind it lay an easement agreement dated exactly 30 years earlier. Arthur had granted a temporary access corridor allowing future residents to reach the shoreline while surrounding property remained undeveloped. The agreement carried a clear expiration date. 3 years ago. It had never been renewed. I stared at the page while the rain outside gradually stopped. Suddenly, every expensive dock, every community gathering, every maintenance truck, every irrigation line, and every polished sign looked completely different. They had not been operating because Denise owned the lake. They had been operating because Arthur had allowed access until the agreement expired. As the evening sun broke through the clouds, my security camera sent an alert to my phone. An excavator had returned to the eastern boundary. This time its bucket lowered directly over another brass survey monument. I watched the live video without making a single call. Denise still believed she was erasing old markers. She had no idea she was creating brand new evidence exactly when I needed it most. Rain was already falling again by the time my dashboard clock reached 4:58. The windshield wipers swept back and forth with steady precision as I drove toward the old spillway where Denise had demanded we meet before the deadline expired. The same warning bell inside the control house echoed across the water every few seconds, its metallic tone cutting cleanly through the sound of rain striking the lake. I slipped Arthur's brass key into my pocket, gathered one weathered survey tube beneath my arm, and picked up a thin folder that contained exactly 6 documents. Nothing more. I had spent the entire night organizing them in the order I wanted Denise to read them. Across the lake, the clubhouse lights glowed warmly while dozens of residents gathered beneath covered walkways, umbrellas moving like dark shapes against polished stone. Denise had turned the deadline into a public event. She wanted witnesses. She wanted everyone to watch the stubborn heir finally surrender. When I reached the dam, her white sport utility vehicle already waited beside the access road exactly where it had been 71 hours earlier. She stepped out carrying the same navy folder, smiling with the same confidence. The attorney stood beside her with a silver briefcase, while several board members watched from beneath the pavilion roof farther down the shoreline. "Right on time," Denise said. "I knew you would make the practical decision." She opened the folder across the hood of my truck and tapped the signature page with one polished fingernail. One signature, and the uncertainty disappears. I looked down at the agreement without touching it. Then I quietly placed Arthur's brass key on top of her paperwork. The small piece of worn metal made a sharp click against the folder. Denise frowned for the first time. I laid the second item beside it. Walter Price's original 1989 survey showing every brass monument still matching the land exactly as surveyed decades earlier. Next came the easement agreement Arthur had signed 30 years before. I slid one finger beneath the highlighted paragraph before looking at Denise. "Read the expiration date." Her attorney leaned closer. His expression changed almost immediately. I continued without raising my voice. The third document was the inventory Denise herself had sent me only the day before. 146 boat slips. Event pavilion. Pump station. Shoreline parking. Maintenance buildings. Primary access road. Every facility she proudly claimed to manage. The fourth document contained still photographs from my security cameras showing heavy equipment removing brass survey monuments during the previous evening. The fifth consisted of county parcel overlays prepared from Walter's verified survey demonstrating where every listed improvement actually stood. The sixth was Audrey's financial summary tracing years of lake preservation fees into Blue Horizon Community Services, the company Denise herself managed. For several seconds nobody spoke. The only sound came from rain dripping off the edge of the spillway roof and the warning bell echoing behind us. Denise finally looked up from the paperwork. "This proves nothing," she said, although her voice no longer carried the certainty it had only moments earlier. Before I answered, 3 county vehicles rolled slowly onto the service road behind us. 2 officials stepped out carrying rolled survey maps and inspection cases. Another vehicle belonged to the county planning office. Walter climbed out of the passenger seat, holding his original field notebook. No one shouted. No one argued. One official simply unfolded a copy of the verified boundary survey across the hood of his truck, while another compared parcel numbers with the easement agreement. The attorney standing beside Denise quietly removed his glasses and reread the expiration page. I watched his shoulders sink almost imperceptibly. Denise tried one final argument. She gestured toward the homes surrounding the lake. "Those families depend on this community." I nodded once. "They depended on an access agreement that expired 3 years ago," I replied. "Ownership never changed. Only the story did." The county surveyor drove a temporary stake into the gravel beside the spillway entrance and attached a bright notice identifying the verified property boundary, pending final administrative review. No celebration followed. No applause came from the residents watching across the shoreline. Only silence settled over the lake while Denise stared at the documents she had unknowingly helped assemble against herself. She had spent years convincing everyone that control looked exactly like ownership. in less than 10 minutes. The paper trail she created herself had begun proving the opposite. 3 months later, the shoreline looked different, although most people would have struggled to explain why. The expensive houses still reflected across the water every morning. Families still launched fishing boats at sunrise. Children still skipped flat stones across the quiet coves exactly the way I had done with Uncle Arthur years before. What disappeared were the polished signs claiming the lake belonged to someone else. The Silver Crest Shores logos had quietly vanished from every dock entrance after the county completed its review. The revised property records restored the original legal descriptions, matching Walter Price's survey exactly as it had been recorded decades earlier. Every brass monument that had survived remained protected, and the damaged ones were professionally restored using the original field notes Walter had preserved all those years. Standing beside him while each marker returned to its proper place felt strangely satisfying. The metallic ring of fresh survey caps being secured into the earth sounded less like construction and more like history correcting itself. Denise Holbrook no longer appeared at community meetings. The board appointed an interim president while independent accountants reviewed years of association finances. Audrey spent several afternoons assisting investigators by organizing the records she had uncovered at the cabin. She never celebrated what happened next. She simply believed numbers should tell the truth, and eventually they did. Residents who had faithfully paid lake preservation fees learned exactly how those funds had been managed. Many of them stopped by the cabin over the following weeks, not to argue, but to apologize. Most admitted they had always assumed the homeowners association owned the shoreline because every brochure, every neighborhood map, every annual meeting, and every sign had repeated the same story for years. They had never seen Arthur's survey. They had never known the temporary access agreement existed. They had simply trusted what looked official. I could have closed every access point the moment the review ended. Legally, I had every right to do exactly that. Instead, I remembered something Arthur once told me while we watched a pair of bald eagles circle above the northern marsh. Owning something does not make you its master. It makes you responsible for what happens next. So I drafted a completely new shoreline access agreement. Local families could continue launching small boats from one designated public dock. Emergency responders retained unrestricted access whenever needed. School science programs could use the wetlands for supervised environmental studies. Commercial events, private rental operations, and paid marina activities ended permanently unless they were negotiated directly with the property owner under transparent written agreements. The lake remained open to neighbors acting like neighbors, not customers paying someone else for permission to enjoy a place they had been told belonged to a corporation. On a cool autumn afternoon, I unlocked the old spillway control house using Arthur's brass key one more time. The familiar scent of machine oil, concrete, and damp timber greeted me exactly as it had on my first visit after the funeral. I placed the key inside a small wooden display case mounted beside the original control panel. Next to it, I framed Arthur's handwritten note. The lake is not the asset. The access is. Visitors who stop by today sometimes ask why I keep that sentence where everyone can read it. I always smile because the answer is simple. The argument was never really about water. It was about the difference between stewardship and ownership, between repeating a story and proving one. Denise believed 72 hours would pressure me into surrendering something my family had protected for generations. Instead, those same 72 hours forced every document, every survey, every forgotten easement, and every quiet piece of evidence into the light. In the end, I did not win because I argued louder. I won because boundaries do not move simply because someone prints a nicer map. Justice rarely arrives with sirens or speeches. Sometimes it arrives carrying an old canvas survey, a scratched brass key, and enough patience to let the truth reach the shoreline before anyone else does.